Hi, fellow geochemists and geochemistry enthusiasts. Welcome to GeoChemISTea, the only podcast for people who love geochemistry with a side of tea. Our mission is to inspire aspiring geochemists and spectroscopists and to introduce our listeners to niche geochemistry and spectroscopy topics. I'm your host, Sam Scher, and this month we're talking with Sam Casement about mineral exploration from space, using remote sensing spectral data to improve exploration programs. Sam Casement is a spectral geologist at Descartes Labs. Sam, welcome to GeoChemistry.
Thanks for having me. Super excited to be on the podcast.
So as we said, Sam is a spectral geologist, and he has about 5 years of experience in industry working in remote sensing. Sam, how did you get into remote sensing? What is it even? And would you recommend to early career professionals about your career, and even more broadly, pursuing something super specific and not core logging right out of the gate?
Yeah, okay, so maybe we start with the basics of what remote sensing is. So what we're really doing is detecting and monitoring characteristics of an area by looking at different wavelengths of light, whether it's reflected or emitted. And this data is collected by different cameras or sensors that could be attached to a satellite in space or an airplane, a drone, tripod, or even some balloons are beginning to be used now, which is exciting.
What kind of balloons? Like a weather balloon
Yeah,
or
the cameras attached to
Turkish
weather
balloons?
balloons and then they go up, which is
Interesting.
awesome.
Okay.
But yes, I started off doing my undergrad in geology at the Royal School of Mines, which is part of Imperial in London. And it was just an awesome course to give you this wide breadth of exposure to different parts of geoscience. It wasn't particularly focused until much further down the curriculum. And that really just allowed us all as students to explore what we found the most interesting and gave us this great foundational platform to build from, which I think makes you a better, well-rounded geoscientist. I had this incredible lecturer and mentor at Imperial, Philippa Mason, who really led many of the teaching courses at Imperial, from sort of core geological concepts to structural geology and multiple remote sensing courses, which is what we'll get back to. And I really liked that applied nature of the topic and wanted to overlap it with my other main interest, which was mineral exploration. So I then went and did my master's with Philippa, and that was focusing on looking at identifying rare earth elements in carbonatite dikes in Namibia. And I was really lucky that I had access to satellite and airborne data sets to interrogate my data. And then it's funny that a month into my research, then a research team at the Helmholtz Institute in Germany published work with drone data over my AOI as well. And so we reached out to them. I was able to get some of that data and incorporate that into my project as well. So I got all these different data sources to play with and explore with. And that's something that not many people, especially students, get access to. So it was this real crossover experience for me, having to understand the physics of light, understand the geochemistry of what I was looking at, of the system, and then overall the geology. And that's really where I fell in love with the topic. And then in tandem to that, I got to attend and present my work at the Geological Remote Sensing Group conference at the European Space Agency in Italy. And this is a small research group, but it's a mighty group that do a lot of amazing events. And it's a conference held every year, every other year being in London. And it's just got so many amazing geoscientists from a variety of different fields who get to discuss lots of different topics. And especially mineral exploration has been the focus for a couple of years now. And so this is something I would recommend anyone interested in remote sensing joining, especially if you're a student. It's super discounted to be a member, and you'll meet some amazing mentors while you're there. And my first experience there, I was really being Philippa's personal bodyguard, because turns out she's a bit of a celebrity in the remote sensing world, which I did not know. And everyone wanted to meet her there, and I was having to manage that schedule a little bit there. But it was
I
great.
understand, because I'm also a bit of a celebrity in my own right.
Getting a hold of Sam Scher at a conference is a challenge, ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you. Um, and then I graduated during the pandemic, right? And so I really had to put the remote sensing into practice and figure out what I could do from a career there. And that's what brought me into the exploration space. So it is a bit of an unorthodox way to get into exploration, as you say, but it's given me a real insight into lots of aspects of exploration, that whole chain that I maybe wouldn't have gotten so early in my career. And I really recommend exploring remote sensing to any geoscientist, because it is this amalgam of skills that you can bring together and apply to your exploration workflow. And you often have to get really creative about how you apply those skills, because you're working with so many different types of data set that could be not only remote sensing data, but geochem, geophysics, drill core data, maps, elevation models, and structural data. We're really wanting to add as much context as you can to help understand what you're looking at and narrow down some targets and ultimately reduce your risk in the field, is what I say.
Yeah, and I think I picked up on one thing that's really important in your story, and that's that there's no right way to do this, in the sense that
Definitely.
sometimes I'll even get a little bit berated. What do you mean you've never? Oh my God, these cats are like trying to lick each other. Oh no, we're not hissing here. To
I
everybody,
didn't
I
hear
just
it.
adopted a kitten. Yeah, so where I was going with this, actually, this will be an interesting
This is going to
episode.
get derailed.
But what I mean by this is there's some people that really believe that in order to be the best geologist that you can be, you have to have gone underground and mapped underground. You have to be a production geologist. You have to have logged core for a certain amount of years. You have to have gone into this, that, and the other thing. And not only is there no right way to do this, because my own story is similar to Sam's in the fact that I didn't have the opportunity to spend 5 years logging core, go underground, or any of these things. So there's no right way to do this. There's the way that you are permitted to do it by whatever the economics of the time are. Hopefully we don't have another global pandemic. And it's just follow what interests you. And if you have the opportunity to really follow that, then I think that's incredible. And you shouldn't feel that you've done it the wrong way, because you got to do it your own way. And I think
Yeah.
it's really cool that you got to starting with an undergrad project that was able to incorporate remote sensing. I think that's fabulous, because it's something that people all the time will lament to me that they've never had this kind of training, whether it's hyperspectral, it's multispectral, anything. They've never even heard of it. Nobody's had a course in it. So it's a thing that people lament. If you get this early exposure to it, dig it
Yeah,
up. So
I felt
cool.
I feel super lucky that we had that. I think there's one of the few schools left out there that are really actually teaching remote sensing. And yeah, a lot of my current job right now is teaching people from the ground up, which is great. But it also means that I get to work with some incredible geoscientists as well that have specialties in other parts of the geosciences world that I can learn from and take from as well. And then actually often, more often than not, give them more questions to take into the field to go and answer, which is ultimately the goal, as well as to answer some of those questions, hopefully, along the way.
I totally agree. I also have given an incredible amount of intro to spectroscopy
Hmm.
courses.
Yeah.
And I continue to do, and I really appreciate the amount of people that are interested in learning. And I think it's something that everybody needs to add to their exploration toolkit. And then I think even if you're involved in mine remediation and cleanup, why not, from an airborne point of view, check out what your tailings piles look like? Because those aren't the same rocks that you put on there.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's just limited to exploration. I think that there's so many applications, even from the remote sensing perspective, that we can incorporate into all parts of the mine cycle. And we're going to talk about this, but I think we're already just very excited. If you ever seen any courses being offered by any of the companies really in any conference, for sure just take them up on it, because all the courses, they're not given by companies so much as the company spectroscopists. They're given by people
Exactly.
that are really rare and really smart. So if you see any of them, just take them up on it, and it will be a great course that you can add to your toolkit as a geologist.
Absolutely. And those people are so great to learn from. There aren't that many spectroscopists out there. And yeah, really grab that opportunity and take as much from them as possible, because it's super valuable. And you're right, the amount of varied application and the number of slightly rogue questions that we get asked is coming more to a head and increasing more regularly to get those questions answered.
All right. So I think that this was a great introduction, and I don't want to distract it from what's going to happen later on in the Q&A, because we could talk about this all day.
100%.
I could. Yeah. So at this point, though, I think it's now time for my favorite segment, which is tea time. You understand tea, which is great. The kettle's hot. Spill.
We have already mentioned this, and I was really thinking about what I wanted to do here, but it is a really exciting time now to be working in the remote sensing space. We have never had better access to data, whilst also having the compute power to be able to process it and push this data to its limits. And we've got even more remote sensing data coming down the line as well. And the latest part of that is working at the incredible team at Descartes Labs. We've been working on how we can process hyperspectral satellites that are becoming available to the community. And some of these are commercial data sets, but also some of these are freely available to access. From the ones that have just come online in the last year are from the German and Italian space agencies. And so they're free to access to the community. And so we're really able to start delving into some of this hyperspectral data. And this is allowing us to be able to map mineral species as opposed to mineral groups, which is something that has never been possible from space before. You would either need an airborne survey or drone data or a spectral radiometer to have in the field for you to be able to achieve this. And so it is this exciting time where we're able to look in areas that we've never been able to before and answer more questions than we have ever been able to as well. So it's very exciting.
Yeah, super exciting. And there's more companies out there than just Descartes. So we'll just say that to everybody now. I'm happy though.
Absolutely.
I'm happy to continue talking about Descartes because you're the one that's on the show, and I'm also a big fan. But for people that perhaps don't have a budget because they're, say, students and they're
Yeah.
looking to see, what this data is, you can, as easily as having QGIS, which is an open source GIS platform, you can download this data, put it into QGIS, and then look at some YouTube videos about how to do all your pre-processing. It's not
100%.
easy. So it's really, honestly, when we'll probably spend a lot of this show mentioning Descartes, which is great, but just know that it's really open to everybody, because not everything, but this data that we're going to be talking about and other data sets as well are open source, which is just so cool. So
totally agree. And the German Space Agency have some incredible YouTube videos that talk about processing hyperspectral data as well. And then same goes for, there's other accounts out there who will deep dive into other sensors out there, like ASTA, which you probably have heard of if you've ever been
I
familiar
think there's
with
this
remote
one
sensing.
Italian guy, and I forget his name, but I learned a lot on QJS by listening to his YouTube channel.
Yeah, QGIS tips and tricks is awesome to find. But yes, I think ultimately a lot of what we're talking about today and the fundamentals of remote sensing have not changed that much in the last sort of 20, 30 years, really. There's a lot of the development has come from the data itself and the speed at which we can process it. The fundamentals are still the same. It's just how we're getting to that final result is changing.
Sorry, everybody. I'm distracted. This cat is, oh my God, let's get off the computer. It's this little kitten is so cute, but I'm just like, no, we need to stop bad habits now.
It's incredible.
Oh my
I
God.
see a tail running across the screen.
Yeah. Look, like
school.
I could, yes, not have them in the room with me, but also anybody that has animals would be like, no, that's silliness. Also, to anybody that's interested, Sam posted a note in our shared file that has the episode outline in it, which says the tea starts so early, sassy.
I'm getting sassed in this
Uh,
document. It's crazy.
I love it. Okay, so let's move on now to the presentation of the show's theme, which today is remote sensing, if you haven't already guessed it. But for this episode, I just want everybody to know that we had to wait for Sam to be less busy because him and Lori Wickert, who also works for Descartes, have put together this really interesting blog piece. And it was entitled Improvements in Mineralogical Classification with Increased Spectral Resolution, a case study over Cuprate, Nevada, comparing fused bare earth composite and ENMAP data.
Yeah, this, and there is another blog that we have sent Sam only today, so she hasn't been able to read it yet, but is hopefully going to be coming out very shortly, is a series of blog posts that myself and as Sam mentioned, Laurie Wickett, who is another mentor, colleague of mine at DL and amazing friend, who has unmatched, really, remote sensing knowledge, and I've learned a huge amount from. And we're discussing this topic that I brought up in terms of the T today. And it's how these new hyperspectral satellite data sets are really changing the game of remote sensing in mineral exploration. And we're comparing both multispectral data to hyperspectral data, and that's the first blog's content. And then in the next blog, we're looking at a hyperspectral satellite with a 30-meter pixel size and compare that to an airborne data set, which has a 1-meter pixel size. And that also includes spectral signatures that were collected in the field. And so it's really allowing us to demonstrate how far we're able to test and push these latest sensors and the level of interpretation we can make in comparison to these other more established data sets. And actually, what we were really surprised to see, particularly with the ENMAP data, it shows how good the results are, even with a 30-meter pixel. This is a brand new hyperspectral sensor, and we're able to get so much more information than we've ever been able to with multispectral data. And so we can tell so much more about what's happening at the surface because of this.
And having a quick squiz at this second blog post that these guys have written and looking at the figures particularly, it is, I don't want to say shocking, but it is shocking. It is so cool with the airborne data in particular. You're definitely seeing the resolution of, oh, here's the ridge of the mountain and this and that and everything. But in terms of, and we'll get into some of this terminology in a little bit, guys, don't worry. But in terms of really being able to see generally which minerals are occurring
Yeah.
and everything, it's really, it's almost there and it's just so cool. I can't wait.
And I think for people who have any experience looking at spectroscopy data, this is where the jump between what you're seeing at surface or what in core really helps you understand what you're seeing in remote sensing, because it's resolutions, that spectral resolution that you're seeing is just incredible and is really allowing us to push the capabilities of remote sensing forward
I
further.
almost want to jump to the spectral ecosystem right here, but we're not going to do it because we need to
Hold on.
define some things first. Before we get to some of these more juicy questions, I love to start off just by having some explanation of terminology. And there's so many terms that we have right now that I just really want to get out of the way just so that everybody's on the same page. I think we did a good job with remote sensing before, but I want to clarify is what is multispectral? What is hyperspectral? How are they
Yeah.
different?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think before we jump into those two, it's best to maybe take a step back and understand what we're looking at in terms of deeper diving into the remote sensing for mineral exploration specifically. So those data sets and these satellites that I've been talking about so far are using optical data. So this is data that is collected based on the reflection of sunlight off of the Earth's surface. And we're looking to understand the wavelengths of light to study the electromagnetic spectrum. Particularly in mineral exploration, we're looking at reflectance values, and every mineral will have a very distinctive spectral signature that we're trying to look at.
Like a
And
fingerprint.
exactly. For any satellite data, the sensors have bands, and I'm going to be referring to bands going forward quite a lot, but these are parts of the spectrum of light that we're collecting over. So if you hear me say bands, think of a graph with a light spectrum on there, and it's the number of points on that graph that we're collecting over. If you think of red, green, and blue bands being the three that you would see if you were looking on Google Earth, then we're looking at 3 bands there. But in other parts of remote sensing, we're looking at more wavelengths of light than that. So we're going into the near infrared, shortwave infrared, and thermal infrared wavelengths. Now, to come back to multispectral data, these are sensors that have tens of bands when we're collecting that data. This has been the standard way of collecting data by satellites for the last 50 years even, and those designs have gotten better, and you've improved the pixel size that we're looking at or the spatial resolution that we're looking at, as well as the wavelengths of light being targeted, getting better to look for certain minerals, because the shortwave infrared is where a lot of those minerals like to have really characteristic absorption features. Now, when we're talking about hyperspectral data, we're moving from tens of bands that we were working with previously, and now we're getting hundreds of bands. So with the Nmap data, for example, we've got 246 bands that we're working with. And this is called improving our spectral resolution, or the number of bands that we have. The more points we have on this graph that we're collecting over, then the more we're going to be able to tell about the surface we're looking at, and in particular, the potential composition of mineralization that we see at the surface.
That was a really good description. And it's not that I don't know what a band is, but it's for me, like I need to have a picture of it so that I can describe this to people. But the points and starting with the RGB, I'm going to use that from now on. That's
There we
such a
go.
good way to describe it. Yeah, I love it. The other thing that I wanted to get into, because we've been talking about spatial resolution quite a bit, and I think that's
Mm.
something that a lot of people can understand a bit better because it's an image and spatial seems to make a lot of sense, but it's also important for other reasons too. So could you just go through us? I think that maybe the 3 most important, and if I miss one and you want to throw it in there too, but can you chat to us about spatial resolution, spectral resolution, and signal to noise ratio, or SNR?
Yeah, your spatial resolution is really looking at how big your pixel size is, right? If a pixel size is 30 meters, that's going to be your spatial resolution that you're collecting over. So you need to think about that very importantly when you're trying to understand, particularly in exploration, how large are your outcrops going to be and what's possible with a spatial resolution of 30 meters, right? And so that could be of more of a regional tool. Now there are other satellites that or airborne sensors that go down to lower spatial resolutions. And so that's one factor that we're always thinking about. The spectral resolution, as I said earlier, that is the number of bands that we're looking at over a wavelength of light. It's also the width of those bands. So say a asteroid scene, for example, has bands that are about 70 nanometers wide. So that's the range at which the wavelengths of light are being collected over. And then compare that to a hyperspectral sensor, which is probably 10 nanometers or less. And so there's a lot more information that you can get because the ranges are smaller. And so you're collecting over more points along that graph again. And we're trying to better understand that fingerprint that Sam was talking about. And then the signal to noise ratio is really the quality of your data. How much noise is being brought in versus direct information that you're getting from your reflectance. And there have been previous hyperspectral missions launched in the past that actually had such bad signal to noise ratio that we couldn't really discern a positive result from the data compared to something that we had that was a real true positive that we were looking at. And so that is a real key point to understand the quality of your data, and something that is the number one question I'm asking when we're looking at new potential sensors being launched, either commercially or through government agencies as well.
Yeah, and I think the last point that I would add there is whenever you as a client or as a research student, you're still a client, are thinking about either purchasing or downloading some data, it's important to figure out exactly what minerals you're interested in, and does the satellite that you're interested in or the airborne data that you're interested in, does that spectral range cover the range of minerals that you're interested in? So it's always important to define first, what is your mineralogy? Are you in an iron oxide deposit? Are you in a clay style deposit, something more like an epithermal system? And
Absolutely.
so yeah, so defining that and then using that in addition to your sensor selection, that's important as well. But yeah, again, so elegantly defined, Sam. I love that.
Thank you.
I don't know if as an American too is your accent as well. I'm just like more believable.
You're not the first person to say that, which is
Yeah.
concerning, I think, but I'll take
Was
it.
it another North American that said that?
Yes.
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 It's how we're conditioned by watching movies and stuff.
Yeah.
We're just like, oh, different accent, you know? Even I think a lot of people in North America are just like, oh, Aussie, so believable. And I'm just like, no.
Mm,
Most of my audience is Aussie, so I love you guys. Thank you for your
there you go.
support.
Covered your base.
So we've talked a lot about mentors, and one of my mentors, her name's Brigitta Martini. She describes spectroscopy to me as an ecosystem where all the different data sets, remote sensing to handheld to core imaging, all these talk to each other. In this sense, where does remote sensing really fit into this ecosystem, and when is it appropriate to use it?
Yeah, I think you already touched on this a little
You
bit in
did,
the
but
last
I
point,
just
but
wanted to
I
like
know,
throw it
and I
in.
think it's worth to expand on that a little bit more. And because remote sensing can actually fit in so many places along the
Mm,
mining life cycle. But if we're thinking, let's keep the niche of exploration here. The sensor that you use is really going to depend on the application or the stage of exploration that you're looking at. As you said, choosing the right data for your needs or the question that you're going to want to ask is going to make sure that you're not overspending or on expensive data, or you're not wasting your time looking at data that will actually not give you the answers that you're looking for. And one way we can look at that, as I said earlier, if we're looking more at a generative approach, then regional multispectral sensors like ASTA or Sentinel-2, which are two satellite sensors, are really commonly used in industry and are fantastic data sets. And we're using 10 to 30 meter pixel size here to target these broad areas of exploration. And they're also excellent when you're having an initial assessment of an AOI that you're targeting. And one of the things that I always say is get the most out of the freely available data and the data that's easiest to access, because then you can really push that to its limits and then see what you need to take forward. This is going to lead you to target areas to focus on or bring you questions for you to take into the field, but it can also allow you to consider looking at higher resolution multispectral data or moving into satellite or higher resolution hyperspectral data as well. So moving into airborne or drone data. And then as you move into brownfields exploration or even mine pit mapping, the resolution of your data is going to need to increase both spectrally and spatially. And it is all really dependent on the application. And we spend a lot of time working with clients, understanding the problem they're trying to solve to make sure that they have the right data for their needs to answer that question, and give them more questions to take into the field as well. But there's a really nice interplay between the remote sensing data and handheld data or core data now that we have this higher resolution data from the hyperspectral perspective, because they just play more nicely that because we have more bands or more wavelengths of light that we're looking at, it seems less abstract, I think, to the geologist who maybe hasn't had much exposure to remote sensing data in the past.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting too as an ecosystem is the fact that if you say you start with your remote sensing data, which is maybe a little bit, almost definitely much more, doesn't have as fine of a spectral resolution. What I
Mm,
find really interesting, and actually what you need to do even, is you will go into the field, you'll do something called ground truthing. And then, really, once you do that ground truthing, what is the next step that you do with that data to make your other data much more of a robust interpretation?
yeah, absolutely. And it's an iterative approach, right? We really want to work back and forth from that data to allow you to optimize your results, to take away, once you've taken those learnings from the field, and really hone in the values that you can get to make sure you have the best maps possible.
I think now just taking a little, maybe a little 180 here to where we were talking a little bit before. But I think what's really important here is to talk about how does one typically interpret remote sensing data?
Mm,
Because it's not
yeah.
easy, right?
And it can be quite challenging to even get the data as well. I think it's best to start there in terms of having to actually access the data can be quite hard. Say it's an open source data set, then you have to download that data from an online archive, which I will say some of these online portals have not been designed to be very user friendly. But once you have got that data, then you need to make sure that it gets corrected both spectrally and positionally, and then you have to mosaic part of that data if it's a large data set. So you have to stitch your data together so it's spectrally balanced and consistent across your output. And this can be really time consuming and is very specialized and can take a lot of time to get skilled at that. And you can process that data through, as we've already talked about, there's some capabilities in QGIS, but there are other pieces of software out there, all with slightly different niches for how you process that data, how you're analyzing your data, or spectral interrogation and visualization. And the best software for your application can be a bit changeable, and that can be a challenge in itself to decide which one to use or to pay for. And then there are also some great tools, mainly in Python, to process your data programmatically, but that's not always a space that every geologist wants to play in either. I'd say for this sort of application, majority of geologists or mining companies are working with consultants to do this processing for you, as well as acquiring any higher resolution data through third parties that are commercial. And that's really been the status quo for many years, I think.
Agreed. And like I said, when I was learning how to do it, I had this really great Italian guy. I wish I looked up his name before. I'll put it in the episode notes so everybody can find him.
Good idea.
Because, yeah, but on YouTube, right? And that's how
Mm,
I figured out how to do it. And look, it's not the way a remote sensing geologist would do it, but it solved a problem that I had at the time. And you can make things like that work. The solution, though, is probably to hire yourself a remote sensing geologist. And they have these different programs which can help them. But I would first say that working with a remote sensing geologist and a spectroscopist themselves, you'll always get a better answer than what you as just a normal geologist can do. But I think what's really cool, a space has been opened by Descartes Lab, which I would love to talk about now, is how it's making the interpretation of remote sensing data more accessible to all geologists.
yeah, and you know, it builds on the points that I just made, and it's the main two ways we've gone about this is through access to the best data that's there and make it easy and quick to process that data. and then how you can really get those outputs yourself without having to have an incredible background in remote sensing. And I work with such a talented group of applied scientists and engineers who have built out these tools and our clients use today. And I am very spoiled that I get to play around with this data and explore all of these different outputs and deposit types, which is another real exciting part of my development as well, that I don't think I would ever have seen this many deposit types or areas of interest if I had gone through a traditional route of processing that data at this stage in my career
I'm going to
either.
interrupt you really quick because
Mm.
I would also say I worked for a hyperspectral imaging vendor as well, and on the core logging scale. And because I worked for a vendor, I got to see so many different deposit styles that I also would never have seen in a more traditional route. So, not saying followers here that you should go and just apply to this kind of thing, but it is a career path that is really special that I think made me an overall better geologist because of the exposure that I've seen to so many different deposits that I
Yeah.
would, again, at this age would have never have seen yet. So
Exactly. It just gives you that big foundation to build on. So anyway, I'll start back with the data in terms of how we've improved that. And that's really the backbone of any spectral processing that you're doing, having the right data to start with. And as I mentioned, we talk about ASTA and Sentinel-2 data. It can be really arduous to look through an entire archive for that sensor, find a scene without any clouds at the right time of year where there's minimum vegetation and other possible factors. And so the team at Descartes Labs created what's called our bare earth composites. And so we've taken that entire archive of data and found pixels with the lowest cloud, snow, ice, shadow, vegetation, water. It's really optimized for outcrop detection and the geologist. And this has all been corrected and mosaicked globally. So you have a single data set to start your processing on. And to go beyond that, we took the best parts of Sentinel-2 and ASTA data. So you want the visible to near infrared from Sentinel-2 and the shortwave infrared from ASTA, and we combine them to make what's called our fused bare earth composite. And that gives us as many bands in the multispectral as possible. Instead of having to go through that rigmarole of pre-processing, you now have this analysis-ready data that's globally available to you. Again, spoiled because I get to go anywhere and look at this data that's ready for me to go look at. And then the team realized that geologists need a way to process data and outside of just a programmatic environment, which some of our clients absolutely love to do, but also limited the accessibility of that experience. And that's why we created Marigold. And this is our online software tool that's been designed specifically with a geologist looking at processing remote sensing data. So like a GIS environment, and you can start processing your data at scale immediately. And I've worked with geologists who have had absolutely no experience using satellite data, who can get incredible insights, through to remote sensing specialists who now have the time to ask the really tough questions and not need to spend their time processing the data, so they can be far more efficient and get more insights out of it. And this wouldn't be possible without our supercompute backend that really allows us to scale our processing over a big area. And I'd say it's quite an addictive tool. No longer do you need to go back to the drawing board when you're looking over a new AOI. Whenever a news report comes up, I'm often having a quick look in Marigold to see if I could see what the geologists could see in the field as well. And it really allows you to start understanding these areas that you're looking at and look at processing large areas, because once you've made a workflow over one AOI, you can just jump to another area that you're looking at and that exact same processing will be applied. So you're not having to go back to the drawing board and processing your data from scratch again. So it's a super exciting tool that I'm very passionate about and very happy that I get to work with such an incredible team who have designed and built this as well.
I find myself, because one of my clients that I worked with currently, they have Marigold. And when I work with clients that don't, I'm like, what are we doing? And I'm like, go and talk to these guys and then come back to me.
Uh,
Just I don't mean to be so promotional, but whatever. It's my podcast. We can do whatever we want. But no, it really does spoil you because the hardest part for me as somebody that doesn't also have Envy or another program that's used typically by remote sensing geologists. So I don't have that. So there's no easy way for me to process data other than to use QGIS. So and then you guys have combined these two satellites together to get even more information out of them. So instead of having 5 bands, seven, now we have 13 bands or whatever it is. So instead of having all that additional information with the no clouds and this,
yeah.
that, or whatever, it's just this nightmare that I'm just like, no, just go ask them and they can deliver something to you because
Genuinely something that would have taken me like weeks to process, I can now do in an hour or so now, which
it's
is just
unbelievable.
insane. And that's the same thing that we really thought about building out from multispectral, moving into hyperspectral. We were using traditional software to process an airborne survey, and that would have taken me about 80 hours to process one classification over this really large airborne survey. To do that in Marigold, I can do it in varying between 4 to 10 seconds. So again, I'm not waiting for this processing bar to move across my screen and probably crash my computer. I'm getting to actually figure out what I'm looking at, understand my area of interest more, and ultimately get better insights from my data as well.
So cool. I think one thing that I don't want to leave before we move on to the next question is just there's a lot of exploration that happens in areas that are deciduous forest or
Mm.
similar. What would you say to people that are exploring in these regions? Do you think that remote sensing is for them or it's just really not on the table?
Yeah, I'm always a realist about what's possible with the data and never want to oversell, right? We are just looking at what's exposed at surface here, or if we're going to be specific, the first 40 micrometers of the surface is what we can see with remote sensing data. So really just the top. And so if you do have areas with extreme lack of exposure, then it's not going to be as an effective tool for you as somewhere that has excellent outcrop, right? It is also about setting the right expectations for what you're able to do. There's some great work that's been done, even just defining areas of outcrop, and that can be very valuable to a geologist going into a field and trying
That's
to
a good
find
point.
areas of exposure, and where you may not get the same level of insights that you would get from a well-exposed area. It's about changing those expectations to know what is valuable to the group that you're looking at as well. And then there's a lot
That's
of
a really
interest that,
interesting pivot. I'm sorry, I need to interrupt. That's a really
yeah,
interesting pivot. Yeah. So if you're in, there's probably saprolite, but if you're in the jungle, if you're in deciduous forest again, like
yeah,
being able to identify where there is outcrop could actually just be so important for just grabbing some rock samples so you're not wasting so much time just trekking
yeah.
through. That's a great point.
Exactly. Even in more northern latitudes, looking at areas that are not lichen covered, so you're not wasting as much time, or moss
Ooh,
covered, then that can be really beneficial. And then cover versus outcrop is another thing that's valuable to look at that. And so again, it's asking the right question to try and work
different
towards getting the most
fans.
out of your data. Yeah, correct.
Yeah,
So many potential
I meant alluvial
applications.
fans to people that are not in my head. Because if you're doing, say, if you want to do some kind of soil survey, difficult. But if you want to do that, say, in the desert in the Andes, but you have a lot of overlapping fans, it's so important to be mapping the fans because if you're taking one sample from one fan and one from another, they don't talk to each other.
Yeah.
That's super important. Oh, wow.
And
Anyway, so many interesting points.
yeah,
Looking for
and
faults to sample faults,
I
looking
don't
for
need to come
little
up with them.
saline ponds to sample those. That was a great paper written a few years ago. Oh my God, we could go on and on.
I know, so exciting.
We should talk
Uh,
about
and
this.
but yeah, let's carry on that conversation afterwards. But also having access to hyperspectral data is opening up new possibilities as well,
Mm,
because there are a few geobotanists out there who there has been good studies that show vegetation aligning with the underlying geology as well. And so there's
I've had
potential
questions about
that,
that.
yeah, can we, and we're still looking into that. Can we look at the vegetation to help us understand what's happening in the subsurface? And that would be an amazing way that this increased level of spectral resolution, where we can start identifying vegetation species instead of mineral species, is a possibility that we want to look at and try and explore. I look forward to delving deeper into that, hopefully.
I would be happy to collaborate with you on that.
Nice.
Okay, separate. Let's keep going. Look, we've talked about this a ton already, but I think it's really important to just say it formally here and now. Can you tell us what happened at the start of this year that revolutionized the application of remote sensing data for everybody?
Yeah, so it is this access to hyperspectral satellite data. As I said earlier, we're getting insights beyond what's ever been possible before, unless you had a lot of money to spend on an airborne survey, which are absolutely incredible. And the second blog post, you will see how much information you're able to get out of those. But they can be expensive, and there are only so many places that these planes can reach, or the companies have capacity to fly. And this means now that we have access to satellite data, we're getting more spectral information that's freely available in more and more remote regions. And we can start answering questions that we haven't been able to before. And it also means that because we have hundreds of bands, we have more of these points on our graph, so we can tell more about the mineralization that we have at the surface. So I talked about mineral species versus mineral groups earlier, but to expand on that, when I'm looking at an ASTA sensor, which is one of the multispectral sensors that has 6 bands in the shortwave infrared, which is really key for looking at clays and white micas, a lot of the hydrothermal minerals that we're interested in targeting. Now, you could have an absorption feature, 2165 nanometers, which there won't be a test later, but that is where you find in the shortwave infrared alunite being present. But it could also mean that you have the presence of pyrophyllite there, or kaolinite and dicite, or a mixture of all of these minerals put together within a single 30-meter pixel. We would not be able to tell more than that without further information or going into the field. And this completely changes with hyperspectral data, because now I can be a lot more definitive in what I say and say that, oh, because I can see that spectral signature, we have the presence of alunite or pyrophyllite, kaolinite or dicite, or a mixture of those are present. And that's because we can tell more about this very specific shape of the absorption features, this fingerprint within the spectra that we can take a look at. So it's really exciting that we get to unlock all of this potential and answer some more questions than we'd ever been able to before.
And just to reiterate, if people want to go and look at these websites, the satellites' names would be Prisma and Nmap. We have to thank the Germans and the Italians for launching these missions. Very
Absolutely.
cool. And I think we really just talked about this with the pyrophyllite, dicite, alunite, etc. But if you have any other cool stories that you want to share with us, what else are you seeing with this transition from just multispectral now to the hyperspectral?
Yeah, beyond Sam having to text me the other day saying, I'm so excited looking at this data, I've had to go on a walk, which made me laugh a lot.
I did.
Then we're really unlocking more information than ever before. And I've had clients who've studied this area in the past with multispectral data, and the hyperspectral data has now completely changed how we're prioritizing going into the field. And maybe another example of that is compositional variability in white mica content. They have this really key absorption feature at around 2200 nanometers, and the position around at that 2200 nanometers shifts slightly depending on the ALOH bond in that mica. So that stoichiometry really affects the absorption feature. And I feel this is where most geochemists actually click with the remote sensing data, because if they can relate it to the bonds,
but yeah.
But if you can relate it to bonds, then I think that's making sense. So these different bonds are absorbing light, and based on the amount of them, they're going to cause this absorption feature to change. And so anyway, at lower wavelengths, so towards around 2180 nanometers, you have This is where you have a much higher aluminium content. So you're looking at something like a paragonite or more paragonitic mica. But as you move closer to 2200 nanometers, then you're looking at more of a muscovitic composition. And then as you get beyond that to 2118 nanometers, then that's when you're going to get more of a phengitic mica. We're actually getting to understand that Schermak substitution a little bit more, and that can actually help us understand our system better. So, it can give us these factors that could indicate things about this particular example, more about your pH, or the temperature, or other examples could be the pressure of the system that you're targeting. And that's something that we've never been able to do before with satellite imagery. You would need that airborne or drone data to look at that. And what I find most exciting is because this data is brand new, and especially through Marigold, we have a quick way to access and process that data. We and some of our clients are probably the first people to ever look and analyze these results. And so we're actually at this really exciting time where we're discovering the potential and what's actually possible with this data. And there's going to be a lot of learning to come out of that as well. So it's really exciting to understand what we're going to be able to discover, and the potential of these data sets going forward.
And the handheld and the core imaging community has done a ton of work on these different substitutions for whether it's chlorates, whether it's white micas, etc. The most famous one being the 2200 nanometer feature in the white micas that we were just talking about. And seeing it the other day in this data set that I was working on, with the combination of seeing the dicite versus the kaolinite versus, I think it was the white mica, and then making a ternary of it, I just had to go for a walk. And you're not wrong. I was like, this is too exciting. It ended up being an active project for a different person in the area. So it was cool rediscovering something that was discovered, but it doesn't look to be crazily drilled or anything when you look at the actual satellite
Yeah,
data. So it actually just overall was, we discovered something.
exactly. There you
Cool.
go.
Yeah. Confirmed. People own it, that area, that ground.
And it's just the amount of information that we're going to be able to take from that. And absolutely, I will say the core scanning and spectroscopy community out there, we're grateful that we're now able to play catch up and take those learnings that you have worked so hard to collect, and then for us to be able to say, how far can we push this data? How much of a subtlety in a signature can I start to understand with this data? And that's only going to improve going forward as we get better and better satellites coming out of it.
Yeah, and as a last point to this is what's really interesting is when you're looking at this feature, you're looking a lot of times at different stocks. This is what I just noticed in the small area that I was working on. Stocks, or I was actually looking at a transition as we came closer to some of these prospects of interest. So it was both interesting from a geologic mapping perspective, but then also interesting from an alteration mapping perspective. So very cool.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to that point of it's to meet your needs, right? There's a lot of different data sets for that. If you want to map alteration and you have great exposure, then that's the perfect tool to be able to do that. But other areas where you maybe don't have that exposure quite so broad, then even being able to hone your geological maps to improve those outputs, you can do a lot of different unsupervised classification techniques as a starter to be able to identify variation in your geology. And again, a very common geochemical technique using principal components analysis to work on your satellite data to be able to distinguish different parts of the geology, and then even different areas of alteration in areas that are well exposed as well.
So cool. That said, pun intended here, thought it was clever, even though I thought of it after the fact. But what's next in this space?
Terrible. Own personal ambitions to grow out the hyperspectral tools and capabilities. There's so much growth in this field, and there are, as I said earlier, more commercial hyperspectral data sets that have just launched or are about to be launched in the next year or two. And these are going to improve our spatial resolution that our limitation with Nmap data hits. So some of these data sets have less than 10-meter spatial resolutions, right? And that jump from 30 to 10 meters is very significant in terms of what we can actually do with the data and how much sort of spatial mixing that could take place. And what I'm really excited to see is just more access to these areas that have been less accessible in the past, whether that's through the data being available or being in the more remote areas where exploration is becoming increasingly more expensive. And so reducing your risk and prioritizing these areas has never been more important than now. And so being able to take more data points and understand that system before you even reach the field is going to help you really prioritize what you're going to look for. And then when you come back, take those learnings, improve those results, maybe take that to the broader region that you're looking at or other deposit types, and then you're going to learn even more from that.
Yeah, and I'll say as my personal contribution, I joined a few years ago now the Geologic Society of Washington, the GSW, and I met a lot of people from NASA. So I'm going to be giving a short bulletin in the coming meetings where there's a lot of NASA speakers, what's going on in, because everybody loves to talk about critical metals, this, that, or whatever. And nobody really, I feel, does anything that helps out our industry. So I'm going to give one to NASA and be like, look what the Germans, the Italians, and everybody else are doing. So what do we got?
Hey, don't worry. They will come back with you and rebuttal. The SBG satellite is coming down the road from NASA with very similar specs to Nmap and Prisma. And so I hope they're taking the learnings. They're taking learnings from these sensors and they're going to improve it even more. I've no doubt. But yeah, so then, again, more data to play with. That means we're going to collect areas quicker. We're going to have a better archive to look at. And we want to be able to use all of these data sets. And in my opinion, the more the merrier, because we've never had this data before with this data quality. So again, I'm being very spoiled compared to a lot of other remote sensing geologists who have had to only work with multispectral data, or the rare occasion they get to work with airborne hyperspectral data is much improved.
So you're being spoiled, and I'm just being like the annoying sister over here that just, I need something better.
Yeah. And then the other side of things, I will say, is the much smaller scale is the access to drone hyperspectral data. It's becoming cheaper. It can be more deployed and very targeted. And some of the scenes that I've seen, particularly from companies like HiSpecs, who are in Norway, they have incredible data sets that really show how much detail we're able to get from some of these sensors now, whether that's drone-based or on a tripod, and we're looking at mapping mine walls or understanding, as you said earlier, potentially what's in our waste dumps or tailings ponds. There's a lot more potential out there for growth in this industry, which is really exciting.
I love that. With that, I just want to thank you so much for being here, Sam. And I really hope that you enjoyed talking about this on the show as much as I liked learning more and also talking about it.
Absolutely. I love geeking out about it.
Yeah, I know. Everybody else just has to deal with it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah. I want to thank everybody else for listening to GeoChemISTea, and a big thanks to Sam Casement for being on the show, dishing some tea and talking remote sensing with us. I want to thank our sponsor, LKI Consulting, and to It's Water and Coma Media for our music, and I'm looking forward to chatting with everybody next month.